It is absolutely absurd that we cannot lawfully sack them.
Today, Britain's biggest police force found out it can't fire officers even if they've failed their vetting. We'll find out why and what it means on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, and shortly we're going to go to Westminster to get the latest on the legislation around assisted dying, because there's been some proposed changes to that have provoked lots of comments. But first of all, today the Metropolitan Police have suffered a bit of a blow in their effort to throw out officers who are accused of misconduct as they try to rebuild their reputation with the public and with women in particular. So basically what has happened is that the Met Commissioner Mark Rowley was vetting or re-vetting lots of officers, and if their vetting if they didn't get a clean bill of health on their vetting, then they were going to get chucked out of the police force. But one officer in particular, a sergeant called Lino Di Maria, went to the High Court to say he hadn't been treated fairly. He had several allegations of sexual misconduct against him, allegations that he always denied and which he had never been charged for. And the court today on Tuesday agreed with him and said actually that wasn't sufficient to chuck him out of the Metropolitan Police. Having his vetting removed was not enough of a reason to remove him from his post. So a bit of a setback for the Met Commissioner Mark Rowley as he embarks on his big mission to rebuild the Metropolitan Police's reputation. They're going to have to go back to square one legally when it comes to the whole revetting thing. So what's been going on and what does it mean? We can chat now to the BBC's senior UK correspondent who's here in the studio with me, Sima Kotecha. Hi, Sima.
Hey, Adam.
And also welcome back Zoe Billingham, who was Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary. Hello, Zoe.
Hi, Adam.
Right, Sima, before we dive into what's happened today, just give us the backstory about why the vetting of Met police officers was happening and was such a big deal in the first place.
Gosh, well, if you've been following the Met like I have for the last several years, it's been marred by scandal and controversy. We've seen racist WhatsApp messages. We've seen scathing reports about the force from people like Dame Louise Casey. We've seen officers being sacked for being very inappropriate with women. We've heard rape allegations. I mean, it's been appalling. And it now has this reputation, let's be frank, across the country of being a force that is, filled with people who are corrupt or criminal. They're doing things like this. And so that is why vetting has been very much on the agenda for Sir Mark Rowley when he came into the Metropolitan Police as the Commissioner 2.5 years ago. And he said, I remember this very clearly from when I've interviewed him at the time, that his priority at the top was to get rid of the bad apples. He wanted to do that from day one. And so that was his objective. And now today, we've seen a man on the steps of Scotland Yard saying, I'm really frustrated. I'm really knocked off because I can't do this. And so he feels that the judgment that we heard today will stop him from doing that and from changing the force, the change that is so badly needed by the force's critics and from Londoners who say they don't trust the police.
And so actually, what was this judgment then in kind of non-jargony terms?
Exactly. Well, let's try. So it was from a serving officer, used to head a forensic unit at the Metropolitan Police. And he's had many allegations facing him of inappropriate behaviour, of rape, everything that he has vehemently denied. He's never been charged. But he's had many allegations over the last few years, from 2019, I think, the first allegation. And he failed the vetting clearance. Now, in 2023, the Metropolitan Police introduced a new vetting system, which they said would record and look at the records of behaviour among those who are coming into the force and those who are already in the force. And they found that certain results were very alarming. They looked at finances, they looked at whether they had criminal records, they also looked at people that these officers were hanging around, so their friendship circles, for example. And they found, like I said, some alarming findings, and then taking those findings into account, they took the appropriate steps that they felt were appropriate to take. And so with this man, he was dismissed. He appealed that dismissal at the High Court, and the High Court judge today ruled in his favour and said that the Metropolitan Police was wrong and that he should not be dismissed because he hasn't had the right to have his say. He hasn't had, as we call in our business, the right of reply.
Yeah, so this basically wasn't a fair process as far as the the court was concerned. And so, Zoe, what does this mean then? What was your reaction when you heard the news on Tuesday morning?
It was a nightmare, an absolute nightmare for policing, because so many people who are interested in restoring trust and confidence across policing have been saying that the police have got to take action against corrupt officers, officers who behave inappropriately, officers who commit domestic abuse or rape, as in this particular case, as is alleged. And I've been very vocal in calling on police forces to make sure that they've got proper systems in place so that they undertake vetting well, that they use all of the intelligence systems. And we've heard the phrase consistently, Adam, that they join up the dots. So what we saw in the case of David Carrick and Wayne Couzens is lots and lots of missed opportunities where one-off, seemingly quite small incidents, if they'd been all brought together in one single intelligence picture, would have sounded such loud warning signs that those officers would have had no place in police uniform. And that's exactly what the Met Police have done, as Sima's been explaining. They've gone through all the records of domestic abuse, of intelligence, of officers going back to 2012. It's been a huge undertaking, and they flagged certain officers where there is lots of bits of information from different places all coming together to present a picture of risk. And on the basis of that, their vetting has been removed and they've been exited from the force. Now, if we can't rely on that, if that's deemed to be unlawful, two things are going to happen. Firstly, there's a prospect of officers being reinstated when they absolutely shouldn't be. And secondly, the public now can't trust the police to actually be rooting out those corrupt officers, which is the promise that the Commissioner has absolutely made.
But why was Mark Rowley and the Met Police relying on a process, this vetting and re-vetting process, that had a legal question mark over it?
Well,
there was always a risk of this happening, wasn't there?
Of course. I mean, I suspect that they didn't think so. The way that police vetting works is, first of all, in order to become a police officer, you have to go through a vetting process. So these officers that have now been rooted out have actually gone into policing where the vetting was not happening in the way that it should. So they weren't vetted properly in the first place. They then have to be vetted every 7 to 10 years, re-vetted. Lots can happen in a person's life in the meantime. So basically what this judgment is saying is that Mark Rowley and all other chief constables who do that re-vetting process, if they find issues that raise a red flag, that of and in itself isn't enough to dismiss them and to move them out of police uniform. There has to be more. So I don't blame the Commissioner at all for doing what he's done. He's doing what everybody has been calling on him to do, which is to root out the corrupt officers. Because of the way that the law has now been framed, though, clearly what's being asked for is more. And I think that that's going to create a real problem for policing in the UK.
So, Sima, what happens next then?
Well, actually, I was just going to say the other side of the coin is important because there are people that genuinely feel that this is the right decision. I mean, the Police Federation, the Metropolitan Police Federation, who supported this man's case, has said no member of the public would tolerate a system where hugely impactful decisions were made on the basis of allegation and not proven fact. Now, I've spoken to some police officers this afternoon who are still serving, and they feel that you should be judged by the court of law, that if you haven't raped someone, you should not be fired for having done so. The other argument, the other side of the coin, if you like, is that in workplaces, you can be fired for misconduct. In any workplace. I mean, for example, here at the BBC. So what happens now? Well, he's appealing the decision, Sir Mark Rowley. He's going to see if he can get things to change. He's also putting more pressure on the Home Office to change the regulation. And a statement from the Home Office, it says it's acting rapidly to ensure police forces could dismiss officers who cannot maintain vetting clearance after, as I said, the commissioners repeatedly call for the Home Office to do so. So the both sides I know are talking today. There's a lot of frustration there from the Metropolitan Police, Home Office saying it's doing what it can.
Zoe, does it sound like maybe with like a flick of Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary's pen, they could get over this hurdle, like by changing some regulations? And there's all those things like statutory instruments and secondary legislation where the Home Secretary can kind of just say they want to do something. It's not like passing a new law through Parliament to get it done.
Yeah, essentially yes. And without going into all of that kind of detail, the regulations, as Sima said, do need to be changed so that if someone fails vetting after they've already joined policing for whatever reason, and keep vetting going every 7 to 10 years, if they fail vetting, that could be a reason for them no longer to hold all the powers of a police officer. The crazy situation that we've got right now is someone can go through vetting and fail it, and then all that the police chiefs can do is put them on leave at taxpayers' expense to sit at home, because Sir Mark Rowley has said he's not prepared to have officers who have got such risk in respect of, what they've done in the past or allegedly done in the past. He's not prepared to have them either working on the front line, undermining trust and confidence of women, which has been shaken to the core anyway, or even having them in the workplace where they may have had inappropriate behaviour, allegedly, with some of their work colleagues. So they're going to be sitting at home wasting taxpayers' money. So I think Yvette Cooper will very much see this as an absolute priority to put right in law, so that clearly the Commissioner can act lawfully but exit people who have no place in policing, and quite right too.
And keeping them on vetting leave will cost millions and millions. And as you said, I think there will be, a desire from government to sort that out quickly, because that is taxpayers' money.
Oh, so this is called vetting leave. So
Vetting
if you fail your
leave.
vetting, you get to, as we were saying, sit at home
You're on
full
vetting
pay.
leave.
It's called vetting leave.
And he said on the steps of Scotland Yard today it will cost millions and millions to keep officers on vetting leave.
And do we know how many officers we're talking about in the
We
Met who are in
do.
a
So
similar
we
situation?
know that dozens are currently on vetting leave. We know that more than 90 were let go last year because of failing that vetting clearance. And now we know that there could be a scenario where many of them are re-employed by the Metropolitan Police because of what's happened today.
And Zoe, just in terms of the bigger picture of the mission to restore trust in the police, whether it's the Met or other forces, I mean, how many steps are we along on that journey, on that process, would you think? I mean, it's a difficult thing to quantify, but are we still at the beginning? Are we making good progress as a country?
I think the problem has largely manifested itself in the Met, hasn't it? And why wouldn't it, when we look at the atrocities of Wayne Couzens and David Carrick? I think the Met Commissioner always knew it was going to take time to turn the tank around. And of course, as he puts in measures like the ones we're discussing today to root out bad apples, there's yet more publicity about corrupt coppers. And that's what we're talking about allegedly today as well. So I think there's still a long way to go before trust and confidence is restored, particularly amongst women, particularly in London. And I think women are still asking themselves, when they dial 999 and come across, a single male officer, is that person there to protect them or prey on them?
And it's worth,
go ahead, yeah.
It's also worth just listening to the fact that you've got the most powerful police officer in the country saying that there are many bad apples in his force, that he is saying there are corrupt officers in his force. And when you just think about that, I know we've been surrounded by all these stories in recent years, but when you actually listen to that, you think, blimey, we're talking about Britain's largest force here, thousands of officers. And he's saying, yes, I've got corrupt, officers, I've got sexual predators in my force.
We maybe shouldn't let the processology of today get in the way of that acknowledgement from him. Zoe, this is an example of something where the Met has tried to take action. Okay, it's maybe not worked first time round, but there's potential for it to work the next time round. Are there things they haven't even tried yet that you would urge them to do?
I honestly think that Mark Rowley has stepped forward and grasped this horrible nettle that he's inherited, and it is a legacy issue. Some of these officers that actually have no place in police uniform have been in police uniform for 10, 15 and even 20 years. So I think he's put a lot of resource into rooting out those bad apples, putting a lot into intelligence so that we can check on their backgrounds, see what they're up to, tracking them when, we don't know that they're visible. So I think he has really invested on the promise that he made when he was appointed as Metropolitan Police Commissioner. But obviously, the more that the stones are overturned, the more bad apples he's finding, and the more trust and confidence dips. I think in maybe 2 or 3 years' time, we'll have seen that the Met will have turned the corner, but it's going to take that long. I've been saying that for a while. And I think it's also really important to say this is not a Met-only issue. Police corruption, this type of behaviour is happening in other forces across the land. And some other forces are not investing in the way that Sir Mark Rowley has to root out these corrupt officers.
On a related note, one of Keir Starmer's famous missions is to halve violence against women and girls. Now, that's not a mission that we hear as much of as some of the other missions. What's your take on just how that mission is going? Or have they even got started on it?
I mean, there's over 1 million crimes relating to domestic abuse, which is violence against women and girls, mostly every single year. I mean, I've been calling for some time for the mission of tackling violence against women and girls to be treated as seriously as tackling terrorism. It is now actually one of the key national strategic threats. It's actually deemed that by the Home Secretary. The problem is, I think we spend £1 billion fighting terrorism, and not anything like that money is being invested in tackling violence against women and girls. Yes, I absolutely believe it's a government priority, and the Home Secretary has demonstrated that time and time again. But there needs to be investment, and the whole system needs to change from beginning to end.
So you want to see more flesh on the bones of that mission?
Certainly do.
Right. Zoe, thank you very much.
Thank you, Adam.
And Sima, thanks for bringing us up to date.
Thank you.
Now, there's been some developments in this legislation introduced by a Labour backbencher to change the law on assisted dying. And the development is that Kim Leadbeater, the Labour backbencher who's introduced this change to the law, has changed what she's actually proposing, having previously said there would be a High Court judge deciding whether every case could go ahead. She has, well, in the words of some people, tweaked it. In the words of some people, watered it down. So let's find out what's actually being proposed, what these changes could mean, and what the reaction has been, because we can chat to Alex Forsyth, who's at Westminster. Hi, Alex.
Hello.
So, the assisted dying legislation, just before we go into the latest news, what stage is this legislation actually at in its voyage through Parliament?
So it's at what's called the committee stage. So we had the big vote, which is when MPs had a chance to vote on whether they, in principle, backed the idea of this legislation, which they did back in November, and a majority of MPs did. So therefore, it went through to what's now known as the committee stage, where you've got, like it says, a committee of MPs who are going through in quite a lot of detail what this legislation would involve, how it would work in practice. They've been taking evidence from witnesses, experts in their fields, to have their say on what they think about this piece of legislation. And right now, there are amendments, so potential changes to that legislation that are being submitted, and that committee of MPs is looking at all of those potential changes, and then it's going to vote on whether they think those changes are a good thing or not.
And for us people who've covered politics for a while, it's actually quite unusual for there to be this level of scrutiny at this stage of the legislation. We don't normally tune in this much detail.
No, and I think that just shows how significant this piece of legislation is, because normally it's those big moments in Parliament when it goes to the floor of the House of Commons, so when all MPs are having a debate on it, or all MPs are having a vote on a piece of legislation. That's normally the bit that kind of captures attention and that everybody's watching pretty closely. Will the vote pass? Will it not? Will the bill go through? Will it not? But I think because of just the significance of the change that this could bring, there has been much closer examination of this stage of this quite long parliamentary process. Everything is getting a lot of attention, and it's not just from us, the kind of journalist class, but MPs in Parliament are paying really, really close attention to almost every element of this piece of legislation, because they're aware that it could have profound consequences whatever happens.
Which brings us to today's news, which was kind of like Monday night's news when it first emerged. Kim Leadbeater, the Labour backbencher who is proposing this legislation, announced she was going to table an amendment to the sort of one of the safeguards. Just talk us through what she's actually suggesting will now change.
Yeah, there were a lot of people who, when they were considering the idea of assisted dying at an earlier stage, were talking about, what are going to be the protections to make sure that people aren't being coerced into this, people aren't going down this route unwillingly. And one of the things that was proposed was, as well as having 2 doctors sign off if somebody was given assistance to end their lives when they've got a terminal illness with 6 months or less to live, there was also going to be a High Court judge that would sign it off. Now, what Kim Leadbeater is saying, so the person behind this bill, is that because they've taken evidence during the course of this committee bit of the bill, some people have said, look, actually, the capacity in the court system might make it really tricky to have a High Court judge sign off every single case. So what she is proposing is something a little bit different. She's suggesting there should be what she's calling a voluntary assisted dying commission, chaired by a High Court judge or a former senior judge. They would then authorise panels to look at every application for an assisted death. And those panels would comprise a legal chair, but not necessarily a judge, and then also have other people like psychiatrists and social workers on them to consider each case. Now, Kim Leadbeater's argument is actually, look, this is adding layers of protection, she says. She says, it's not just the fact that there would still be a legal element, although on the panel, like I say, it wouldn't be a judge necessarily. But she's saying having other people like psychiatrists and social workers might help spot coercion or other things, other people being pressed down this path when they didn't want to be. So that's her argument. But as you might imagine, on the other hand, there are some people saying actually this is a watering down of some of the safeguards around this bill. And from some other parties, it's caused quite a lot of concern.
And it's interesting, the arguments that the opponents are using. Some of them are saying, well, this proves all along there was never going to be space in the High Court to deal with the claims. So therefore, there was never going to be a safe system that involved the High Court. So there's a sort of practical objections. And then there's the sort of processy, are you telling the truth kind of objections being levelled at Kim Leadbeater, saying, well, you promised us there would always be this High Court element and now you've stepped back from it.
Yeah, I think exactly right. And I think you can boil this all down to two things, really. Obviously, the detail of a piece of legislation like this is really important. And I think whenever you speak to MPs about this particular issue, whether they support the idea of assisted dying or not, I think people are at this stage, now that MPs have voted in principle for it, they are keen that every detail of this piece of legislation is examined really closely and is right at the end of the day. But then more broadly, I think some of the arguments and the contentious points and the disagreements around this speak to how strongly people feel about this issue on both sides, and quite rightly, as you say, Kim Leadbeater is saying that this would actually strengthen the bill. She's calling it Judge Plus. The people who don't support the bill, but also it's probably important to say there are some people who supported the idea in principle with that vote, but then said they did want to really closely examine the safeguards that were put in place. And, there's some people there expressing concern about a potential watering down. So the feelings are running incredibly high. And I think you might expect that because, just coming back to that point in the beginning, this is potentially such a profound change, an issue of such significance that could have real consequences for life and death of many, many people. I think, the strength of feeling on either side hasn't changed at all. If anything, it's just intensified. And
just to go back to what you were saying there about that label that Kim Leadbeater's put on this new proposal, this new setup as Judge Plus, how does she justify that it's Judge Plus if actually this commission that sets up the individual panels might be chaired by an ex-judge, not a current serving judge. And actually, it doesn't sound like the judge themselves will ever be doing any judging of the case.
Well, no, and also the expert panels, like I say, would have a legal chair, but we don't know that would necessarily be a judge. So her argument is that you've got lots of layers and there's a legal element to it. And it is also the case that any decisions taken by these panels that are being proposed could then be reviewed by the High Court. But it is very clearly not what was suggested before, which is where a High Court judge would have the sign-off on every single case. So that's the really key shift. And I guess the argument for MPs is going to come down to whether they think, as Kim Leadbeater is saying, this is a strengthening of the protections because now you've got people like social workers and psychiatrists involved, or as the people who are concerned about this and perhaps concerned about the bill more broadly are saying, which is this is a loosening of the protections and it's left them really concerned.
Yeah, so she says it's Judge Plus, but to other people it might be plus social worker minus judge.
Yeah.
And in terms of just what happens next, I'm a bit foggy on how long this bit of this stage lasts for and actually when's the next kind of crunch vote, to use some journalese in Parliament.
Jargon. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's actually quite hard to say because the committee stage can last for as long as it needs to. There's not a kind of set time frame on the committee stage. And at the moment, the understanding is there are about 300 amendments or proposed changes to this bit of legislation that this committee of MPs is going to have to look at and go through line by line and decide whether or not these amendments should happen or not, these changes to the legislation should happen or not. So that could last for quite a long time. And it's only at the end of that process that it will go back to the full House of Commons, to all MPs, to have another a debate, and then there could be further amendments tabled and changes proposed by all MPs, and then another crucial vote. So we don't really know exactly when that's going to happen. But there is a sort of, I mean, this is where parliamentary process becomes horribly complex. But thankfully, I've just been picking the brains of a colleague of mine who knows all about it, and he's told me that this is what's going to happen. So this committee stage could go on for a while before you get another vote on the floor of the House of Commons. And then, if MPs at that point approve it, it will go to the House of Lords and could go backwards and forwards between the House of Lords and House of Commons for a little while before it would become law if it's approved by the House of Lords and House of Commons. But the whole thing needs to be finished in this kind of parliamentary session. So that's before the next King's speech. So there is a bit of a time frame for it to have to get through all of those stages.
And actually, it's the government that decides the timetable in Parliament, even for private members' bills. So if the heat gets too much and the government decides this is not something they want to facilitate or provide parliamentary time for, they could just kick it into the medium grass, and then another King's speech comes up to start a new session of Parliament, and this would have to go back to square one.
Yeah,
which
it could run out of time.
If the politics means that that's what the government needs to do, that's what they could do. Not that I'm suggesting there's any sign that that's what the government business managers are planning, but in theory that could happen.
Yeah, and there's a lot of discussion about whether or not, with a bill of this magnitude, whether or not, there's enough time to look at every kind of aspect of this legislation in great detail. The people behind the bill say there absolutely is, and they're taking all of this scrutiny really seriously, and it's going through the parliamentary process. But there are other people that think it needs a bit more time, or there were MPs, for example, even though it was given a full day's debate at the last stage when all MPs got to have their say, there were some MPs that didn't get to say what they wanted to, because there's always a time crunch in Parliament with these things. So there are other MPs that are saying, look, we just feel like this hasn't had enough scrutiny and parliamentary debate. So it's kind of tricky on all sides. And I think that's why when we got that first really significant key vote from MPs that backed this bill in principle, it was clear that was a really significant moment that had happened, but it certainly wasn't the end of the process. And now we're really seeing that process play out.
It's just so interesting, though, that how these things end up getting framed, particularly in the media, because when it was people like Esther Rantzen campaigning for the right to have medical assistance to take their own lives if they were very ill at the end of their life, it was a campaign against the status quo. But now that it's become a piece of legislation in black and white, a lot of I don't quite know what words to apply to it, but maybe some of the momentum then goes to the campaign against it, because that's the new thing.
Yeah, because it's going to be like a big change, right? As in, it would be a really, really big change. And what's really interesting about it is if you think about, like, when Parliament makes new laws, that's like a big part of what Parliament does. And, it deals with legislation all the time. But to the point you made earlier, it's quite rare that we all kind of, pull back the curtain and peer at the process in quite the same way that we are doing for this piece of legislation, because it would be such a significant change to the way that things work and have worked for such a long time in this country. So it's getting all of this kind of extra attention and scrutiny for that reason. And you're seeing that, like, process of making laws with all of the consequences that it comes with. It's something that MPs do pretty frequently, amend laws or change laws or discuss laws, but this one, because it's the first time it's going through this process to this, level, it's really, really being closely examined. And you wonder what that will do to how MPs feel about it, because there were some MPs that before were like, I'm voting for it at this stage, but let's see where this gets to, I want to be sure if this is actually going to come into law about all of the different elements of it. And I think that's what you're just starting to see now. And the focus at the moment is this particular issue around a High Court judge and the role they may or may not have. But there are likely to be others as this kind of goes through the next few months in Parliament.
Alex, thank you very much.
Pleasure as always.
And as we finish recording this episode of Newscast at 6:47 p.m. on Tuesday, there's a bit of other breaking news from Westminster, which is that the Labour Party has suspended 11 councillors in Greater Manchester who were also in that WhatsApp group, which included the former Labour MP and former Minister Andrew Gwynn, where people had posted offensive comments. So that's another 11 Labour Party councillors suspended, including Andrew Gwynn's wife, who was also in that WhatsApp group. And this is in addition to Andrew Gwynn, the MP, being suspended from the Parliamentary Labour Party, and Oliver Ryan, another one of his Labour colleagues as an MP, who was suspended on Monday because he was also in the WhatsApp group. So that is the latest on that story, which broke at the weekend and which we've covered now on a couple of episodes of Newscast. And that's it for this episode. Thank you very much to everyone who's been on it. Thanks to you too for listening to it. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye-bye.